Imagine waking up in ancient Egypt and discovering something is terribly wrong. The Nile has not risen. Not this year. Not next year. And eventually, not for 10 years. For most of the world, a river is just a river. In Egypt, it was everything. It decided who ate and who starved. It decided who ruled and who fell. So what happens if the one system an entire civilization depends on simply stops working? This is not a story about something that happened exactly this way. It's a thought experiment built from real history. 10 years without a healthy flood. Let's find out what that world might look like. To understand the danger, you first have to understand the miracle. Egypt sits inside a desert. Almost no rain falls there. And yet, for thousands of years, it fed itself so well that it became one of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth. The reason was a single yearly event, the flood. Every summer, monsoon rains far to the south, in the Ethiopian highlands, sent water rushing down the Nile. By late summer, it reached Egypt and spread across the fields, carrying with it thick, dark silt. That silt was natural fertilizer. It renewed the soil every single year for free. Egyptian farmers built their entire calendar around this rhythm. Flood season, planting season, harvest season. The state built its identity around it too. Egyptian rulers didn't just govern a country. In the eyes of their people, they helped maintain cosmic order, and the flood was proof that order was intact. So the flood wasn't background scenery, it was the engine. Now imagine that engine sputtering year after year. The first year is unsettling, but not yet frightening. The flood arrives late and weaker than usual. Some fields that normally sit underwater for weeks barely get touched. Farmers who depend on the flood's reach start doing quiet math in their heads. How much less land can be planted this season? The harvest comes in smaller, not catastrophic, just smaller. Grain reserves absorb the shock because Egypt has always known that floods vary from year to year. 1 weak year is expected. It's normal. It's survivable. But something else happens in year 1 that matters more than the harvest itself. People start watching the river more carefully, and that quiet anxiety is the first crack in the system. The flood comes again. And again it disappoints. Now the reserves that absorbed last year's shortfall are thinner. Households that stored grain for hard times begin drawing on it faster than they'd like. Local officials, whose job includes recording flood levels and estimating harvest taxes, start sending more cautious reports up the chain. This is where a hypothetical low-flood decade stops being an abstract idea and becomes a lived experience. Bread, the absolute foundation of the Egyptian diet, becomes a little harder to guarantee. Beer, brewed from the same grain, becomes a little more expensive to make. Nobody is starving yet, but everybody is calculating. By year 3, the shortfall stops being a household problem and becomes an economic one. Grain in ancient Egypt wasn't just food, it was currency. Wages were often paid in grain. Taxes were often collected in grain. If the harvest shrinks 3 years running, the entire economic bloodstream of the country starts to thin. Prices for grain would likely rise. Officials responsible for local granaries would face growing pressure to release stores that were meant to last much longer. And a plausible consequence is that trust in the harvest, trust in the system, trust in the idea that things return to normal, starts to erode. This is the moment the story stops being about farming and starts being about power. Now the pressure spreads outward. Some families, especially those without stored reserves or strong local connections, would likely begin moving toward cities, toward the river's healthier stretches, toward wherever grain still seemed reachable. Migration like this wasn't unheard of in Egyptian history during hard years, and a multi-year shortage would only intensify it. Labor becomes a flashpoint too. Egypt's major building projects and temple economies depended on organized workforces that were fed by the state. If grain is scarce, feeding those workers competes directly with feeding ordinary families. That's a tension officials cannot ignore forever, and inequality sharpens. Wealthy households and powerful temples with deeper reserves and more land weather the shortage more easily than small farmers. The gap between those who are secure and those who are desperate would likely grow wider every season. Political pressure builds quietly underneath all of it. In Egyptian belief, the king's role was tied to maintaining balance, what they called mat. A ruler who could not deliver a healthy Nile was, in the eyes of many, failing at the most fundamental part of the job. actually experienced real low flood periods, and we have evidence of what followed. One striking example is the Famine stela, an inscription describing a 7-year period of low floods and hardship attributed to the reign of a very early Egyptian king. Historians debate exactly when it was written and how literally to read it, but the story itself reflects something Egyptians clearly feared and remembered: a multi-year failure of the flood and a ruler judged by how he responded to it. There's also stronger evidence from the end of the Old Kingdom, around 2200 BCE, when a series of low Niles coincided with regional instability and the fragmentation of centralized rule. Researchers studying this period point to weaker floods as one contributing factor, among several, not a single dramatic cause. And that distinction matters. So a hypothetical 10-year shortage isn't inventing a new kind of crisis. It's stretching a real documented type of event further than history happened to record it. At this stage in our thought experiment, patience starts running out. Local unrest becomes more plausible, not necessarily open rebellion, but smaller signs of strain. Disputes over grain distribution, tension between regions with slightly better floods and regions with worse ones, and growing criticism directed carefully at those in charge. Administrators face an impossible balancing act. Release too much stored grain too early, and there's nothing left if the crisis continues. Hold too much back, and hungry people lose faith in the system meant to protect them. Religious explanations would likely intensify too. In a worldview where the flood reflected cosmic and royal order, a prolonged failure invites uncomfortable questions. What has gone wrong? Who is responsible? Egyptian society didn't separate politics and religion the way we often do today. A crisis like this would be interpreted on both levels at once. By the final stretch of our hypothetical decade, something important happens: adaptation. Societies under sustained pressure rarely just collapse in place. They change shape. Trade networks reaching south toward Nubia or east toward the Levant could become more vital, bringing in grain or goods to offset local shortfalls. Regions with any residual flood advantage would likely become more important, shifting the internal balance of power within Egypt itself. Storage and administration would likely become more centralized and more strict, because a decade of scarcity teaches harsh lessons about the cost of poor planning. And socially, this kind of prolonged pressure often accelerates changes that were already happening slowly. Shifts in who holds land, who holds authority, and who the population trusts to lead them through hardship. By year 10, Egypt in this scenario looks different. Not destroyed. Different. Here's where we should challenge the dramatic assumption. 10 years without a healthy flood sounds like an apocalypse, but real historical evidence suggests something more complicated. The Old Kingdom's decline, linked partly to weak Niles, unfolded over generations, not a single sudden collapse. Egyptian civilization, even in its hardest recorded periods, tended to fragment, adapt, and eventually reconsolidate, rather than disappear. A plausible outcome of our hypothetical decade isn't the end of Egypt. It's a transformed Egypt, one with a reorganized government, a changed relationship between regions, and a population that remembers, for generations, just how fragile their foundation really was. Collapse makes for a dramatic headline, but resilience under extreme pressure is, historically, the more common story. And that brings us to the real point of this thought experiment. The Nile wasn't just a water source for ancient Egypt, it was the operating system underneath everything else: the economy, the religion, the government, the culture. Every part of Egyptian civilization was in some way downstream of that single yearly event. 10 hypothetical years of failure don't just threaten farms. They stress test an entire civilization's foundation, all at once, revealing which parts are essential, which parts are fragile, and which parts, surprisingly, hold firm even under years of pressure. Every civilization has its version of the Nile, a single system so essential that almost nothing else matters if it fails. For ancient Egypt, it was a river's yearly rise. For us, it might be a power grid, a food supply chain, a climate we've quietly assumed will stay the same. The lesson from a hypothetical decade on the Nile isn't really about ancient history at all. It's a question worth carrying with you. What's the one system holding up your world? And how well do you actually know what happens if it fails?